Hey guys, I'm Tom the Tech Chap, and it feels like I've got my own little genius bar going on here because I'm surrounded by MacBook Pros. Because I want to find out if there's really that much difference between the M1, the M1 Pro, and the M1 Max. And so to find out, hopefully, I've got the MacBook Pro 13. This is the current one you can buy, although it's about a year old. The standard M1, along with 16 gigs of RAM, or Apple's unified memory. And then we've got this guy, which is the entry-level spec MacBook Pro 16 with the M1 Pro, and also 16 gigs of unified memory. And then finally, we have the money no object, basically, pretty much top spec MacBook Pro 16, M1 Max, the very top SKU, and also 64 gigs of unified memory. And so your first thought is, Tom, that's not fair because these have 16 gigs and that's 64, and you're right. This would be a little bit fairer if this also had 16 gigs of RAM, but well, these are the three laptops I have to test. Also, when you do go for the M1 Max, regardless of what amount of RAM, the bandwidth is double, so there's always going to be a difference there. And also, probably, if you are going to go with a Max, then most likely you'll upgrade to at least 32 gigs of RAM anyway. So yes, I appreciate it's not completely laboratory scientific, but hopefully this will give you an idea and an impression of the difference in performance between the three. And also, in terms of the 14-inch, which I don't have here at the moment, you can get the 14-inch in both the Pro and the Max specs, but there are three small differences. Firstly, the base 14-inch MacBook Pro only comes with a 8-core CPU and a 14-core GPU, whereas the base 16 comes with a 10-core CPU and 16-core GPU. So like for like, the base 16-inch is a little bit faster. Also, the size difference means we have this extra surface area and probably a little bit more thermal headroom with the bigger models, although that's going to be harder to quantify. But one specific difference with just this one, which is the M1 Max MacBook Pro 16, is we have this energy mode option in the battery. This is the only model that comes with this, and you can switch between low, automatic, which is on by default, or high power mode, which doesn't change the clock speeds or anything, but it unlocks some of the fan restrictions. So you'll probably hear the fan whir up a bit more, and you'll probably get better sustained performance. But for this test, I'm gonna leave it in automatic, which it is by default. But let's kick off with a bit of Cinebench and Geekbench, and immediately you can see that the single core is pretty much the same between all three chips. But in terms of multi-core, going from the M1 to the Pro, there's a good boost there, but then nothing really gained going to the M1 Max. But then switching to the OpenCL compute test, this is more of a graphics benchmark, and you can see some massive differences here. We're going from 20,000 to 37, that's almost double. But let's switch to Blender, because a lot of people use this, and it's a really good benchmark of overall system performance, particularly the graphics as well. So as I was running these tests, this was by far the best sort of visual demonstration of the performance difference. Now, to render 500 frames of this project, it took 5 minutes on the Max, 13 minutes 49 on the Pro, and 23:49 on the base M1. I also played a bit of Shadow of the Tomb Raider on these three, which obviously is the industry standard benchmark for testing new MacBooks, but it's one of the few games with a benchmark tool that runs on Mac. And at Full HD Plus, we're getting 22 FPS on the M1, 51 on the M1 Pro, and 90 on the M1 Max. But really, if you want to play games, then you should probably just get a Windows PC. And finally, firing up a bit of the 3D Mark Wildlife Extreme benchmark, which is technically an iPhone/iPad app, but it is available on the Mac Store, and I thought I'd give it a go. We're looking at 28 FPS versus 56 versus 106 frames per second. But what about video editing? I think for me, this is the most important area, as I spend half my life in Premiere Pro, and actually having just recently updated to the 2022 version, I did notice some significant boosts to performance. So make sure you are running the latest Premiere version. And in fact, pretty much the whole Adobe suite is now optimized for M1. But obviously the Pro and the Max, not only do we have that raw performance with the more CPU and GPU cores, but we also have that dedicated media engine. But just watching these side by side, playing back on the timeline, the Max is consistently a lot smoother. We do see more, as you can see right here, juddering and slowdowns, even on the M1 Pro and the standard M1 as well. So in my experience, even just scrubbing around the project, the Max is noticeably smoother. I had to test this like 3 or 4 times because I couldn't quite believe the results, but I ran a export test of my 10-minute project, 4K, 422 as I say, and the results are pretty crazy. We're looking at 20 minutes, 36 seconds on the M1 versus 11 minutes 58 on the M1 Pro versus just a hair under 7 minutes on the M1 Max. And actually, before I updated to the 2022 version, this Max was actually around 12 minutes as well. So it seems there are a lot of M1 Pro and Max optimizations with the most recent version, so definitely get that. Now, of course, the extra unified memory in here will also play a role in that. So if you just have the M1 Max with 16 gigs of RAM, which I don't know if I'd recommend that really, that difference won't be quite as significant. The M1 Max does seem to be worth it in Premiere Pro and also Final Cut Pro, but not quite in the same way. I used a very similar project, ran the same export test, which took 12.5 minutes on the M1 MacBook Pro 13, but then on the M1 Pro, it was only a minute faster, 11.5 minutes, compared to the M1 Max, which was just under 7 minutes. So it's 5 minutes quicker, which may not seem like a lot in the grand scheme of things. I mean, you could just go make a cup of tea or make a thumbnail or something, but that adds up over projects. So I didn't know if this would be the case, but if you are a video editor, then it seems like the M1 Max is the way to go. However, not so much if you're a photo editor. I loaded up 500 raw photos in Lightroom and timed how long it took them to convert to JPEG. The M1 took 2 minutes 58, the M1 Pro took 2 minutes 3, and the M1 Max 1 minute 46. Which makes sense really, and I think the advantage there with the Max is having that extra memory. It's a CPU intensive task, and the biggest gain in terms of CPU performance, of course, is from the M1 to the Pro. The Max is much more about the GPU. But the best bit about all these Macs is that you get the exact same performance regardless of whether you're plugged into the charger or you're using it on battery, which is a massive deal for me as someone who likes to edit on planes and trains and out and about. I don't always have a charger around me. So let's wrap up. Which one should you go for? Well, I would say none of them. I think for 90% of the people out there, the MacBook Air is the best one to go for. The Pro 13, yes, it has a fan and you get slightly better sustained performance, and well, the touch bar isn't really a selling point anymore. I would save you money, go for the Air, get 16 gigs of RAM and maybe a 512 storage with it. But for me at least, the Pro 13 doesn't really make much sense. For most people, for just general use, get the MacBook Air. Between these two, it's a bit more straightforward. How important are the graphics for your workload? If you're a video editor, graphics designer, game designer, 3D artist, one of those things, then yes, definitely get the Max. It does make a big difference. It doesn't compromise on the battery, and I would probably get 32 gigs of unified memory with that. So for me, as a video editor, given how actually it did improve my Premiere Pro and Final Cut experience, I would go with an M1 Max. But that is also very expensive, and if you're not editing multiple 8K streams or designing games, then just get the M1 Pro in either the 14 or the 16. This is such a good laptop. They're all fantastic laptops. You can't go wrong with any of them really, but I think the 16 with a terabyte storage, 32 gigs unified memory, and the M1 Pro, while expensive, is probably the go-to spec. And breathe. That was a lot, and I appreciate that wasn't a fully scientific analysis between them, but hopefully gives you a rough idea. If you've got any questions, then just leave a comment below and I'll do my best to answer them, and I will see you next time right here on the Tech Chat. Thanks for watching.